No, we have to move this. All right. And everybody can see this, right? Maybe a thumb for me? Thanks, guys. All right, I'm going to throw a couple of questions out there to you guys just to see if you're paying attention. This is actually a fairly important lecture, believe it or not. A lot of you are going to be dealing with photography. And even if you don't become a photographer and you end up going into anything digital, you really want to know about the history that has led up till now. And since we're working with Photoshop, it's really actually kind of important to understand why we rely on certain devices as a means to communicate, digitally. So let's start. This is the very first known photograph ever made. It was actually discovered about 20 years after the one we thought was the first one. And this is, and it's a fun name to say, Nicéphore Niépce, a French artist who dabbled in photography. And photography has existed for a long, long time. It's the ability to fix the photograph onto either metal or paper that actually made the science kind of elevate into the 19th century. And this is the earliest one that we have. It was basically discovered in the back of a closet on a metal plate. And this is the outside of the artist's studio. And you'll note that I've got this here as exposed for 8 hours. That means that the camera lens, the aperture, was open for that long in order to be able to actually solidify this onto, and burn it, essentially, etch it onto the surface of the plate itself. But the reality is Louis Daguerre was the very first one who perfected it. And he had a background as a painter. When photography was, started to become popular, basically painters across the board throughout the entire world said that painting is dead. But the reality is the two actually started to really speak with each other. Photographers would use the language of painting, especially as it relates to still life, because it was sitting still. But also, painters started to respond to photography as well. So artists like Degas and Monet actually use photography in their work. And what you're looking at here is a still life that took 10 to 15 minutes to expose. And what this exposure process actually entails is called a wet plate collodion immersion process, which is basically either a glass or a metal plate that's covered in a kind of silver nitrate. And when light hits it, basically it etches it onto the silver plate itself. So it acts a little bit like film, but it's a little bit different. But this is essentially a daguerreotype, and they last forever. But this is based off of the science of a camera obscura. And a camera obscura basically just means dark room. If you take a room and you black out every single bit of light that might come in, and you just puncture a hole into the wall, what happens is inside on the opposing wall, everything that's outside is projected upside down and backwards. Why is that important? Well, you don't actually need a lens in order to create this sort of camera obscura. And it's the ability to it's the ability to fix this onto a surface, either paper or a plate, that enabled photography to actually be invented. So, this is basically a giant pinhole camera. And you can make a very small pinhole camera with just a shoebox, if any of you have ever taken photography. And I've got a little slide here. I'm not going to work through that. But if you want to do it, it's really quite easy, and you can buy everything on Amazon. And the reason why pinhole photography is still taught today is because it basically teaches you how to make an image purely using the elements and principles of design in order to communicate successfully an aesthetically pleasing image. There is a degree of chance involved in this, but the reality is you have to be a great technician in order to a great technician and a great designer in order to get a good pinhole camera. And it really does reduce the fundamentals down to its purest essence. Here's another pinhole camera. Look at how crisp it is. And this does not include or even need a lens in order to be created. People have created pinhole cameras out of things like paint cans. But you can also make your own pinhole camera pretty much out of anything, as long as it's sealable and you can keep the light out. So you see a Lego pinhole camera, you see an old whiskey container, and a cigar box, or a Whitman chocolate sampler. So how does a camera work? Well, the chemical is painted on essentially to a surface. It's light sensitive. It's suspended on there. It dries, but it dries in a space that has no light, so it's never exposed. It's put into the camera, or the pinhole camera, and then it's exposed to the light either by using a lens or just by simply uncovering the hole itself. And when that surface is exposed to the light, it creates essentially a burn or etched in negative. And then that negative is brought into a dark room, and that film or that plate or that piece of glass is essentially another photograph is taken of that in that space, and that's how you get a positive. So the idea of a negative is that it's essentially the reversal of both the value and the color. So whether you're taking a black and white photograph or a color photograph, it's in reverse first, okay? So, camera obscura, again, just to review, means dark chamber or dark room in Latin, okay? It's been around since, honestly, the 12 or 1300s. So the science has been around, the optical science has been around for hundreds of years. It's just the ability to fix it that's made photography inevitably possible. This is also one of the earliest known photographs. It took a long time to expose it. This is actually a really, really busy street it's very famous. It's a very, very busy street in Paris. If you're in my 101 class, you already know a little bit about this. But there's a single figure in this image. Do you see it? There's a single man in this image. Does anybody see it? Wakey, wakey, eggs and bakey. Shall I start calling on the attendants?
I see him. He's near like the bottom left corner.
Yeah.
On the corner of the street by like the water pump. I
Yeah.
think I've seen this one before.
Probably. Does anybody know who's not in my 101 class what's happening with him right now?
I think he's getting his shoes shined.
Yeah. So the idea is that there's like 1,000 people in this photograph, but 1,000 people are not being captured in this photograph because the exposure time, or however long the lens was open, the aperture was open, it didn't capture the movement of the people moving about the streets. There's horses, there's carriages, there's people walking about, but this is a man who only stood there long enough and still enough, probably 10 or 15 minutes, getting his shoes shined in order to be captured in this photograph. So you see that the technology was quite limited. We also have the beginnings of documentary photography, and it's and I want you to really put yourself in this space here. In the 19th century, nobody knew what war really looked like unless they were there. So what that's actually doing to a collective subconscious, what that does to modern man, as we understand our limited time on earth, but also the inherent violence in human nature, really was not only provocative, but kind of earth-shattering for people at the time. So imagine these photographs being published in the local newspapers and not being illustrated by drawers or illustrators. These were real photographs, and so it really did shake people. But also the idea of manifest destiny, which is problematic if you Google it, but the idea of the American West and all of these things that went beyond the colonies, the extensive space that was uninhabited, virtually uninhabited. Of course, we have Native Americans inhabiting most of this stuff. But the reality is, it's really vast and kind of epic environments that were being publicly broadcast in the form of photography. And these photographs that were documentary photography basically had to have been actually, produced in movable and mobile darkrooms. So these documentary photographers actually had wagons that were complete darkrooms that didn't allow in any light, where they could develop these photographs in situ. And it really was quite dangerous. Much of Matthew Brady's his caravans, his trailers, his wagons had giant bullet holes all the way through them. So he'd have to constantly be like plugging them up so that the light didn't corrupt the images. It was also the time where poverty was on display for America in a way that really got the sort of nation caring about the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And it's this situation here that's happening in New York City that are sleeping in, some of the worst, abjectly not only dangerous environments, but filthy environments that really did relegate the humanity of these people to something of, second-class, third-class citizens. And it got people really organizing. If you think about the organization of unions, you think about tenement laws, all of those things are because of these photographs right here, taken by a series of people, but Jacob Riis being one of them. This is what New York City used to look like in the 19th century. And it's people living in single tenement apartments, like basically one-room apartments, with 10 or 15 people living on them, in literally one-room apartments. So it's these photographs that really got into the American subconscious that allowed people to become more socially active and care a little bit more and pass laws that prevented this sort of scenario. We also have the beginnings of photographs of celebrities. This is Sarah Bernhardt, who was one of the most famous actresses working, and Nadar was considered to be one of the most important ones. He did invent aerial photography, by the way, in a hot air balloon. And Julia Margaret Cameron, a woman, was shooting very, very atmospheric, kind of ghostly Victorian photographs that really were reminiscent of the Romantic painting movement and the Romantic poetry movement. They're generally really allegorical, they're super sentimental, and they're just kind of white women walking around with their hair down looking high as kites. But really, she was very, very popular and still has a lot of influence today. Another one of hers. And it's Edward Muybridge, an American who is actually responsible. He's considered to be the father of film. And he's considered to be the father of film because he originally got into a bet with a friend of his. And the bet was, when at a gallop, does a horse ever have all 4 feet or all 4 hooves on the ground? What do you think? When a horse is at a gallop, does it ever have all 4 hooves on the ground?
No.
No?
Probably not.
Yeah, you got to guess. But how would you know unless you had photography to tell you? Is one photograph going to tell you that? Probably not. The timing absolutely has to be completely perfect, right? So what he did was, in this experiment, in order to prove his friend wrong, he set up a series of about 50 cameras at different intervals, like every 5 or every pace or so that a horse would take. And he set up this rig that would photograph the horse as the horse ran across the scene. And that's what we have here. And so he's considered to be the father of film because what happens when you put all these together? You get moving film. You get motion pictures. So, answer my question now. Based on these, does a horse at a gallop ever have all 4 feet on the ground?
No.
No, it doesn't. So he won the bet. You all know this photograph. You've seen it. Taken during the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, which was a government organization that sought to put artists to work because of the Great Depression. And much of the Works Project Administration elevated the human spirit and really did showcase the difficulty that the American population was really having during this time of abject poverty and the Great Depression. And then that moves us into the 1980s, where we suddenly have a departure from darkroom photography being the only means of manipulating photographs. Here we have Sandy Skoglund, who's one of the first people incorporating a very, very, very new series of software programs that allow digital manipulation of photographs. And what we have here are radioactive cats. But as an influence to that, other sort of more fine artists, that was a fine artist as well, but other artists who are more well known for their other works, like David Hockney, who's known as being primarily a painter, were experimenting in the vein of photography. This is, 100 photographs taken all from the same vantage point, with the only thing moving being the camera. And then each one at 4x6 is developed and then put together, cobbled together as a collage. And these were very, very popular in the mid-1980s of his work. You can open up any design book and see these works. And then, of course, Ansel Adams. And why do I have Ansel Adams at sort of the end of this? I have Ansel Adams at the end of this because Ansel Adams never stopped manipulating his photographs. He did manipulate his photographs in the darkroom, but he worked in prints, right? And in working with prints, he was working with editions. So even though he was taking a lot of these photographs in the early 1900s, well into the 20th century, he was manipulating them and continuing to basically modify them. And of course, how do we know what the American Indian looks like? How do we know what natives look like in the American West if it weren't for photography? But this sort of approach to this frontal new form of portraiture really gave us a different kind of voice. It gave us a very confrontational, very different kind of aesthetic about character. And Richard Avedon's portraits do that. Oftentimes he's photographing very unique personas. And this is a beekeeper. Actually, it's not a beekeeper. It's a member of what we call a freak show, sort of circus traveling troupe. But he also photographed people who are just hardworking Americans, coal miner. Henri Cartier-Bresson is known for his photographs that are perfectly captured. He's considered to be the father of photojournalism, and it's photographs like these that are captured at the most perfect moment in a single shot. But also it's why we understand the Black American experience as well. Photographers like Gordon Parks, who are photographing people across the country, but this is out of New York. And these are really, really beautiful and heart-rending photographs. Bessie and Little Richard the morning after she scalded her husband. And this is, really a showcase of, the after effects of domestic violence. And some of them are very, very ironically in opposition of what American values have been crammed down our throat that aren't necessarily as accurate as we would aspire them to be. We also have surrealists playing with photographs. We talked about that at length a couple of lectures ago, but this is Man Ray. And we talked about this as well. But we also have the documentation of not only artworks. This is what we call a lie-in. This is John and Yoko Ono in 1971, photographed by Annie Leibovitz in Time magazine. But this is actually an entire project that they did where they basically spent, I think, a week, maybe a month. I can't remember what the performance art was or the length of time, but they spent like a month in bed nude and invited journalists to document that whole process because they considered themselves to be, artists. Yoko Ono is a very well-known visual artist. And then, of course, the photographs that are etched in our minds that sort of become part of our collective psyche in celebrity America. Other artists that are doing really interesting things with the language of photography is Hiroshi Sugimoto. This is an hour and a half long open aperture photograph. So this photograph is actually capturing the entire movie as it projects on the screen. And so the meditation then becomes, what is time? And is a photograph an actual snapshot? Or is it actually the marker of the passage of time? And what a lie that is. He also does seascapes. These are very, very large and very, very beautiful. Renique Dijkstra photographs people who are right at the transition of some major change. She's done an entire body of work of young people who are on the transition into adulthood, right in the depths of puberty, which we all know and love, right before they turn into men or women who have just given birth, literally just given birth, like within an hour. Bullfighters who have just finished fighting their bulls. Nan Goldin is one of my absolute favorites. She is what we call a kind of diarist in her photography. Oftentimes they're of her love, her lovers, her friends, in her life in general. And some of them are difficult photographs. The most popular ones that she's known for are in the 1980s when she was living in Chelsea and kind of squatting for the most part. Heavily on drugs. She did a little bit of sex work. But for the most part, she's a very, very famous artist now. She also did an entire body of work, pun intended, of her friends making love, literally while she was in the room. And people who exist on the fringes of society. She's photographing drag queens and trans folk in the 80s. And we talked a little bit about Dwayne Michaels. And these are some of his. Robert Mapplethorpe was a photographer who died in about 1991, I think, of AIDS. I own a Robert Mapplethorpe photograph, by the way, a self-portrait. He really was responsible for getting Americans talking about censorship, because a lot of his work was censored specifically by Mayor Giuliani in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Well, he was a part of an exhibition that traveled around the country called The Sensation Show. And he does have photographs that are much more kind of explicit, and I'm not showing you here, of the male nude. But also he was sort of challenging the conventions about gender and the sort of expectations that are imposed upon men and women. And then we have contemporary artist David LaChapelle, who uses digital means and post-editing in order to push his photographs into another sort of realm. This is a very famous trans activist, model, celebrity who exists in New York still today. This is Amanda Lepore, who has had so many surgeries you wouldn't be able to stop but look at her. And of course she is being photographed by David LaChapelle to look like who? Who is this a famous artwork that's in the style of? Help me out.
Marilyn Monroe.
Done by who? Who's the artist?
Andy Warhol.
Good. Mad points to you in Gryffindor. He is absolutely painting into these. He's absolutely amping up the color. He's flattening out backgrounds. There is a movie that he directed and did all of the cinematography for that you should all see called Rise, R-I-Z-E. And it's a documentary that was taken in LA in mid-2000s of people doing crunking, which is crazy drunk dancing. And it's fascinating. I kind of think I'm going to show it to you guys. You'll really enjoy it. And here's that film. It is absolutely beautiful. The visuals seem impossible. And there is an After Effects editing going on in the imagery. Diane Arbus, and that's how you actually say it. It's not Diane, it's Deanne, would sneak out in the middle of the night. She was sort of a, posh, very well-to-do married woman who didn't really have a day job, and she would sneak out at night and would go and photograph people all across New York and into Jersey for their unique qualities. And there's this really sort of like wonderfully tender, strange way of photographing these personalities. So if you're interested in just sort of the humanity of otherness, she's a perfect person to look at. Young couple in the Bronx. I have no idea how old they are, but I am jarred by how old they probably are. They're probably like 16 or 17, but they look like they're 11 or 12. And the problem is they look like they're 11 or 12 because they're probably smoking now and they're not well nourished, right? So it really is about poverty sometimes and access. And then we're ending, we're close to the end here. This is Collier Shore. She is a photographer who is famous for this series of photographs that she did of boy wrestlers in high school. And, young people who are sort of at the precipice of adulthood who really are sort of evocative of these sort of very adult moments. And the sort of male Adonis that is right in that period of time. And we talked about Andreas Gursky in my last lecture. And these are all digitally manipulated in order to seem infinite. We talked about Cindy Sherman as well. And you want to sort of look up Cindy Sherman maybe over the weekend. You want to look her up because the next project is essentially based off of her. So take some time and look at her work. And then, of course, the works that I addressed that she makes now. And then we'll end on Shirin Neshat, who is an Iranian, now she's an expat, I think she's an Iranian American now, who uses digital manipulation as well as modifying the actual print. So she's drawing on the prints themselves in order to examine the perceptions of the Iranian woman. And the Iranian woman, for her, this is not, this sort of hijab-wearing, faithful Islamic woman who is a terrorist is absurd to her because that is not all of Iran, right? That is a fundamentalist minority, right? But that is what the media is really putting out there. And she seeks to really explore the damage that is done on these perceptions about women's bodies, about the perceptions of the Middle East, and about the perceptions of Islamic women. She lives here today, and she's very well-known, not only photographer, but filmmaker. And then we're ending on Chris Scarborough, who manipulates actual photographs in order to become these sort of otherworldly, creepy portraits that I am just absolutely delighted by. So we're ending there. I'm going to stop